The hospital room is quiet, except for the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the whisper of oxygen flowing through plastic tubes. Carl Sagan lies in a bed at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center in Seattle, his body ravaged by 3 bone marrow transplants that have failed to stop the myelodysplasia consuming him from within. It is December 1996, and the man who once spoke to 500 million people about the cosmos can barely speak above a whisper. Through the window, rain streaks down the glass, blurring the lights of the city below. The weather in Seattle has been unrelenting this month, grey skies and constant precipitation, as if the universe itself is mourning what is about to be lost. Carl watches the raindrops race each other down the pane, his mind still making observations, still noting patterns, still trying to understand the mechanics of even this simple phenomenon. It is what his brain has been trained to do for 62 years: observe, question, analyze, wonder. On the table beside him rests a manuscript, Pale Blue Dot. The title comes from a photograph taken by Voyager 1 from 4 billion miles away, where Earth appears as a single pixel of light suspended in a sunbeam. Sagan has spent the last months of his life writing about this image, about what it means to see our entire world reduced to a mote of dust in an ocean of darkness. He knows he will not live to see the book's full impact. He knows that pneumonia is filling his lungs, that his sister Carol's donated bone marrow could not save him, that at 62 years old his time for looking up at the stars is ending. The pages of the manuscript are marked with his handwriting, corrections and additions made in moments of clarity between the fog of medication and pain. Some passages he has rewritten a dozen times, searching for exactly the right words to convey what he sees in that photograph. How do you make people understand that every human who ever lived, every civilization that ever rose and fell, every war ever fought, every love ever consummated, every dream ever dreamed, happened on that tiny point of light? How do you translate cosmic perspective into human emotion? But even now, even as death approaches, he is thinking about how to make people understand, how to translate the mathematics of cosmic distance into the poetry of human meaning, how to take the cold equations of astrophysics and transform them into wonder. This has been his life's work, not the research papers, not the NASA consultations, not even the television fame. The work has always been the same: to make people feel what he felt when he first looked up and realized how small we are, how vast everything else is, and how miraculous it is that we exist at all to ask these questions. Anne is here, sitting in the chair beside his bed, reading quietly. Every so often she looks up to check on him, and when their eyes meet, she offers a small smile that contains everything they cannot say aloud. They have been married for 15 years, and she has been his partner in every sense. She co-wrote the scripts for Cosmos, helped design the Voyager Golden Record, collaborated on book after book, and most importantly, understood the obsession that drove him. She never asked him to be someone he was not, never demanded that he choose between his work and their relationship, because she understood that the work was not separate from who he was. It was the core of his identity, the organizing principle of his existence. In a few days, Carl Sagan will die. But the story of how a working-class kid from Brooklyn became the voice of the cosmos, how he learned to speak for humanity to the universe and the universe to humanity, begins 62 years earlier in a tenement apartment where a 5-year-old boy asked his mother a question that would change everything. Before we continue with Carl's remarkable journey from that Brooklyn apartment to the greatest stages of science, I want to ask you something. If this story is already capturing your imagination, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support makes it possible for me to keep bringing these stories to life. And I'm genuinely curious, where in the world are you watching from today? Whether you're in New York or New Delhi, Tokyo or Toronto, drop a comment and let me know. Now let's go back to Brooklyn, 1939, and discover what happens when a child's curiosity meets a mother's encouragement. The year is 1934, and America is drowning in the Great Depression. In Brooklyn, in a crowded tenement apartment where the smell of boiling cabbage mingles with the sounds of Yiddish and English shouted through thin walls, Rachel Sagan gives birth to a son. She names him Carl Edward. His father, Samuel, is a Ukrainian Jewish immigrant who cuts cloth in the garment district for wages that barely keep the family fed. His mother is the daughter of Austrian Jewish immigrants, a woman who never had the education she deserved, but who reads voraciously and thinks constantly about the world beyond the Brooklyn streets. The apartment on 52nd Street in Bensonhurst is a universe unto itself, a microcosm of immigrant life in Depression-era New York. 3 rooms for a family that will soon expand to 4 when Carl's sister Carol is born. The walls are thin enough that you can hear the Goldbergs arguing upstairs, the Kowalski's radio playing Polish folk music next door, Mrs. Chen singing lullabies in Cantonese to her infant across the hall. The building is a babel of languages and cultures, everyone struggling, everyone hoping for something better for their children. In summer, the apartment becomes an oven. There is no air conditioning, and opening the windows brings in the sounds and smells of the street below. Vendors hawking their wares, children playing stickball, the occasional argument that threatens to become a fight. Samuel comes home with his shirt soaked through with sweat, his hands cramped from 10 hours of cutting fabric. He is a quiet man, exhausted by work, not given to displays of affection, but there is gentleness in the way he ruffles young Carl's hair when he walks through the door, a wordless acknowledgement that everything he endures is for his family. Rachel manages the household with fierce efficiency and quiet desperation. She shops at 3 different markets to find the best prices, darns socks until the darning itself needs to be darned, makes soup from bones the butcher would otherwise throw away. She never complains, at least not where the children can hear, but sometimes Carl wakes in the night and hears his parents talking in urgent whispers about money, about bills, about how they will manage if Samuel's hours are cut again. Carl grows up in an environment of density and scarcity. The apartment is small. The neighborhood is loud with the sounds of families compressed together by economics and circumstance. There is never quite enough money. Samuel works long hours and comes home exhausted, his hands stained with fabric dye, his back bent from standing at the cutting table. Rachel manages the household with fierce efficiency, stretching every dollar, making sure her children, Carl and his younger sister Carol, have what they need, even when there is not enough to go around. But Rachel gives Carl something that costs nothing and means everything. She encourages his questions. When the boy asks why the stars shine, she does not brush him off. When he wonders how high the sky goes, she does not tell him to stop bothering her with nonsense. Instead, she tells him to find out. She takes him to the library and shows him that the answers to his questions exist in books, that knowledge is not locked away for the wealthy or the privileged, that a poor Jewish kid from Brooklyn has just as much right to understand the universe as anyone else. Rachel herself is a frustrated intellectual, a woman born in the wrong time and circumstances. In another life, with different opportunities, she might have gone to university, might have studied literature or history or science. Instead, she left school at 14 to help support her family, married young, and found herself trapped in the same cycle of poverty her parents had fled Europe to escape. But she reads everything she can get her hands on, newspapers, magazines, library books on any subject. When Carl asks her questions, she often does not know the answers, but she knows how to find them, and more importantly, she knows that not knowing is the beginning of discovery, not a source of shame. There is a ritual that develops between mother and son. Every Saturday, weather permitting, Rachel takes Carl to the Brooklyn Public Library. It is a 20-minute walk from their apartment, and along the way, Carl peppers her with questions. Why is the sky blue? What makes thunder? Where does the sun go at night? Rachel answers when she can, admits ignorance when she cannot, and always encourages him to look it up when they reach the library. The library is a cathedral to Carl, more sacred than any synagogue. The smell of old books, the hushed atmosphere of concentration, the seemingly infinite rows of knowledge waiting to be discovered. It is intoxicating. The children's section is cheerful and bright, but Carl quickly exhausts its offerings. He wants the real books, the adult books with complicated diagrams and dense text. The librarians initially resist, suggesting age-appropriate alternatives, but Rachel is firm. If her son wants to read about astronomy or physics or chemistry, he should be allowed to try even if he does not understand everything yet. Carl reads about the solar system and learns that the Earth orbits the Sun, not the other way around. This fact astonishes him. For his entire short life, he has watched the sun rise in the east and set in the west, the most obvious daily phenomenon, and yet the appearance is deceiving. We are the ones moving, spinning on an axis, orbiting a star. The evidence of his senses is wrong, and only through science can we know the truth. This revelation, that the universe does not care what seems obvious, that reality can contradict our perceptions, will shape Carl's thinking for the rest of his life. The moment that changes everything happens in 1939. Carl is 5 years old when his parents take him to the New York World's Fair. The theme is the world of tomorrow, and the exhibits are designed to make people forget the Depression, to show them a future of technological marvels and scientific progress. Young Carl walks through the Futurama exhibit, where miniature cities showcase highways and skyscrapers and machines that do not exist yet. He sees demonstrations of television, still a novelty. He watches robots perform simple tasks. He stands in front of the Trilon and Perisphere, enormous white structures that seem to reach toward the sky itself. The journey to the World's Fair is itself an adventure. The Sagan family takes the subway, and for Carl, who has rarely left the neighborhood, the ride is thrilling. The train emerges from underground at some points, and he presses his face to the window, watching Brooklyn give way to Queens, familiar tenements yielding to unfamiliar landscapes. Samuel has saved for months to afford this trip, and there is a palpable sense of occasion, of doing something special, something to remember. The fairgrounds are overwhelming. Hundreds of thousands of people crowd the walkways, speaking dozens of languages, their faces alight with wonder and hope. The Depression has made the world feel small and grey and limited, but here everything is bright and expansive and possible. The Trilon, a 700-foot white obelisk, and the Perisphere, a massive globe, dominate the landscape. They are monuments to the future, symbols of humanity's capacity to dream beyond present circumstances. Carl's parents indulge him. Taking him from exhibit to exhibit, he sees a robot named Electro that can walk and talk and smoke cigarettes. He watches a demonstration of a new material called nylon, stockings that supposedly will never run. He stands in line for the General Motors Futurama ride, where he sits in a moving chair and travels through a miniature landscape of the America that will exist in 1960. Superhighways with cars traveling at 100 miles per hour, streamlined cities with no poverty or crowding, a world made perfect through technology. But it is not the machines that capture him. It is the planetarium. In a darkened room, Carl looks up at projected stars and hears an explanation of what they are. Distant suns, worlds impossibly far away. The lecturer explains that light from some of these stars has traveled for years to reach Earth, that when we look at them we are seeing into the past, that the universe is so vast that our minds cannot truly comprehend the distances involved. The lecturer is an elderly man with a gentle voice and an obvious love for his subject. He points to different constellations projected on the dome above, telling their mythological stories: Orion the Hunter, Ursa Major the Great Bear, Cassiopeia the Queen, before revealing the scientific reality behind them. These are not pictures in the sky, he explains, not patterns created for our benefit. They are accidents of perspective, stars at vastly different distances that happen to align from our viewpoint on Earth. Some of these stars are larger than our entire solar system. Some are already dead, their light still traveling toward us long after the star itself has exploded. 5-year-old Carl sits in the dark, neck craned back, mouth slightly open, completely transfixed. He feels something he will later learn to call the numinous, a sense of encountering something greater than himself, something that demands reverence and attention. It is not unlike what people describe feeling in religious moments, but for Carl, it is not God he is encountering. It is the universe itself in all its strangeness and vastness and indifference to human concerns. When the presentation ends and the lights come up, Carl does not want to leave. Rachel has to gently pull him from his seat, and even as they exit the building, he keeps looking back, as if afraid the stars will disappear if he takes his eyes off them. On the subway ride home, he is unusually quiet, his mind working on something he cannot quite articulate. Samuel and Rachel exchange glances over his head, recognizing that something has shifted in their son, but not yet understanding what it means. Carl's mind does something in that moment that it will spend the rest of his life doing. It reaches, it stretches beyond the walls of Brooklyn, beyond the poverty of the Depression, beyond the limitations of his circumstances. He begins to understand that there is a reality larger than tenements and garment factories and the daily struggle for survival. There is a cosmos. There are stars. There are questions worth asking and answers worth seeking. When he gets home, he asks his mother what stars are made of. Rachel does not know, but she does not pretend to know. Instead, she tells him they will find out together. The next day, true to her word, she takes him to the library. Carl gets his first library card, a small rectangle of cardboard that feels like a key to another world. The librarian helps him find books about astronomy. He begins to read. The books are written for adults and much of the language is beyond him, but Carl does not care. He sounds out the words he does not know. He studies the diagrams. He learns that stars are made of gas, that they burn through nuclear fusion, that some are larger than our entire solar system. He learns that planets orbit stars, that our Earth is one of several worlds circling the Sun. He learns that the universe is ancient beyond comprehension and vast beyond imagination. Each discovery leads to new questions. If stars are suns like ours, might they have planets too? If they have planets, might those planets have life? If life exists elsewhere, what might it be like? Would it be like us, or completely different? Could we ever communicate with it? These questions consume him, not as idle speculation, but as urgent mysteries that demand answers. At school, Carl is bright, but not extraordinary. He is good at mathematics and science, but so are other students. What sets him apart is not raw intelligence, but obsession. While other children play stickball in the streets, Carl reads about Mars. While his classmates talk about baseball, Carl thinks about whether life exists on other worlds. He is not socially isolated exactly, but there is a part of his mind that is always elsewhere, always reaching toward questions his peers do not care about. His teachers notice his interest in science and try to encourage it, but they do not quite know what to do with him. The curriculum is fixed, designed for the average student, and there is no accommodation for a child who wants to know why gravity works or how we know the Earth is round. One teacher, Mrs. Kellerman, lends him her own books on astronomy and stays after school to discuss them with him. She is the first person outside his family who takes his questions seriously, who treats his curiosity as valuable rather than strange. When Carl is 12, the family moves to Rahway, New Jersey. Samuel has managed to get slightly better work, and the new apartment is marginally less crowded than the Brooklyn tenement. But the move is difficult for Carl. He leaves behind the few friends he has made, the library he has come to know, the streets he has memorized. In Rahway, he is the new kid, the outsider, the strange boy who reads books about astronomy instead of comic books about superheroes. The new school is different from his Brooklyn elementary school, larger and more impersonal. The students are mostly children of factory workers and small business owners, practical people focused on practical futures. When Carl tries to talk about the possibility of life on Mars, his classmates look at him like he is speaking a foreign language. Space is for science fiction, for Buck Rogers serials at the movie theater, not for serious conversation. Carl learns to keep his interests to himself, to perform normalcy during the school day and retreat into his books in the evening. The loneliness of this period is acute. Carl is at an age where peer acceptance becomes crucial, where fitting in feels like survival, and yet he cannot bring himself to pretend interest in things that bore him. He tries, briefly, to care about sports, to follow the Yankees season and have opinions about players, but it feels like work, like learning a foreign language for a place he has no desire to visit. His real passion remains the stars, the planets, the possibility of other worlds. Rachel remains his anchor. She continues to encourage his curiosity, continues to take him to libraries, continues to tell him that his questions matter. When Carl expresses frustration that he cannot find anyone who wants to talk about the possibility of life on Mars, Rachel tells him that someday he will find those people, that the world is large and full of others who wonder about the same things. When he worries that his interests make him weird, she tells him that being different is not a weakness, that the people who change the world are always those who see things differently from everyone else. During these years, Carl discovers science fiction. He reads Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tales of Mars, stories of ancient civilizations and dying worlds. He knows the science in these books is wrong, knows that Mars is not covered in canals built by intelligent beings, but he loves them anyway. They feed something in him that straight astronomy cannot quite satisfy. They give him permission to imagine, to wonder, not just what is, but what might be. He devours H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds, thrilling to the idea of Martian invaders even as he notes the scientific inaccuracies. He reads Isaac Asimov's Foundation series and marvels at the idea of psychohistory, of using mathematics to predict the future of civilizations. He discovers Arthur C. Clarke and is transported by stories of humanity's expansion into the solar system and beyond. These stories do something crucial for adolescent Carl. They make the future feel possible, make space exploration seem not like fantasy, but like destiny. At night, when the sky is clear, Carl sets up a small telescope his parents have scraped together money to buy for his 13th birthday. It is not a sophisticated instrument, just a modest refractor that can show him the moon's craters and the moons of Jupiter, if the atmospheric conditions are right. But to Carl, It is a portal to another reality. He spends hours looking at the moon, tracing the shadows of mountains and the smooth darkness of the Maria, the seas that are not actually water, but ancient lava flows. He finds Jupiter and, on clear nights, can just barely make out the 4 Galilean moons, Io, Europa, Ganymede, Callisto, small points of light in a line on either side of the planet. Each observation fills him with wonder and also with a kind of longing. He is seeing these worlds, but only from an impossible distance. He will never walk on the moon, never explore the canyons of Mars, never dive into Europa's ice-covered oceans to search for life. The technology does not exist, and even if it did someday, it will not be in his lifetime. This knowledge is painful, a sense of being born too soon, of living in a time when humanity can see these worlds but cannot yet reach them. Yet there is also something hopeful in this longing. Carl realizes that even if he cannot personally set foot on another world, he might contribute to humanity's understanding of those worlds. He might be part of the generation that builds the foundation for future exploration. The telescope in his hands is primitive, but someday there will be better telescopes, spacecraft that can travel to these distant places, instruments that can analyze their atmospheres and surfaces. And if Carl works hard enough, learns enough, contributes enough to the science of planetary study, he might help make that future possible. On winter nights, when the air is clear and cold and the stars seem especially bright, Carl sometimes brings his notebook outside with the telescope. He sketches what he sees, makes notes about which features of the moon are visible, tracks the positions of Jupiter's moons from night to night. He is teaching himself the discipline of observation, learning to look carefully, to record accurately, to distinguish what he actually sees from what he thinks he should see. These solitary hours with the telescope become a form of meditation, a practice that will stay with Carl for the rest of his life. There is something about looking up at the cosmos that puts everything else in perspective. The arguments at school, the financial worries at home, the loneliness of being different. All of it seems smaller when viewed against the backdrop of infinity. Not insignificant exactly, but less overwhelming. The universe is vast and old and indifferent to human concerns, but somehow this fact is not depressing. It is liberating. By the time Carl graduates from Rahway High School in 1951, he knows what he wants to do with his life. He wants to study the planets. He wants to understand whether life exists elsewhere in the universe. He wants to answer the questions that have consumed him since that day at the World's Fair, when he first looked up at projected stars and felt the immensity of everything that exists beyond Brooklyn. The problem is money. The Sagan family does not have the resources to send Carl to an expensive university. Samuel's income has improved slightly, but not enough to afford the tuition at prestigious schools. Carl applies for scholarships and is accepted to several institutions, but it is the University of Chicago that offers him the best financial package. The school is known for its rigorous liberal arts program and its community of Nobel laureates. In the fall of 1951, at 17 years old, Carl leaves New Jersey for Illinois. He is leaving behind the world of tenements and garment workers, stepping into a world of Gothic architecture and Nobel laureates and students from wealthy families who have never worried about whether their parents could pay the rent. The train ride to Chicago is Carl's first time traveling such a distance alone. He sits by the window with a book on planetary astronomy, but his attention keeps drifting to the landscape passing outside. The factories and row houses of New Jersey give way to Pennsylvania farmland, then to Ohio's industrial cities, then to the flat expanses of Indiana. The country is so much larger than he has imagined, and he is struck by the thought that this is just one small corner of one small planet circling one ordinary star in a galaxy of hundreds of billions of stars. The sense of scale is dizzying and exhilarating. At one point, somewhere in Ohio, the train stops at a small station. Carl watches through the window as passengers board and disembark, as luggage is loaded and unloaded, as a mother tries to calm a crying infant while juggling bags and tickets. He sees an elderly couple saying goodbye to what must be their son, the father's handshake formal and restrained, the mother's embrace lasting just a moment too long. These are ordinary human dramas, the kind that happen thousands of times every day across the country, across the world, and yet each one is a universe unto itself, as complex and meaningful to the people living it as Carl's own journey is to him. This observation stays with him. Part of what will make Carl such an effective communicator later in life is his ability to hold two seemingly contradictory truths simultaneously: that human concerns are tiny and insignificant when measured against cosmic scales, and that they are also profound and meaningful precisely because we are the universe's way of knowing itself. We are matter that has become conscious, and our small dramas are the cosmos experiencing itself subjectively. But at 17, on a train to Chicago, Carl does not yet have the language to articulate these ideas. He just feels them, a complex mixture of excitement and melancholy, of anticipation and nostalgia, of confidence and terror. He is leaving behind everything familiar to pursue something most people cannot understand. He does not know if he will succeed. He does not know if the questions that consume him will lead to answers or just to more questions. All he knows is that he has to try. At Chicago, Carl studies everything. The university's liberal arts program requires students to take classes across disciplines, and Carl throws himself into philosophy, literature, history, as well as mathematics and physics. He is hungry for knowledge in a way that goes beyond mere ambition. He has spent his entire childhood feeling that the world is larger than what he has been allowed to see, and now, finally, he is being given access to that larger world. He takes a class on Greek philosophy and encounters the pre-Socratics, ancient thinkers who tried to explain the cosmos through natural principles rather than mythology. Thales believed everything was made of water. Anaximander proposed an infinite, eternal universe. Democritus argued that everything consists of indivisible atoms moving through void. Carl is struck by how close these ancient Greeks came to modern scientific thinking without any of the tools of experimental science. They had only observation and reason, and yet they asked the right questions. In literature classes, Carl reads the Romantic poets and is surprised by how much their language of awe and wonder resonates with his own feelings about the cosmos. Wordsworth's sense of being disturbed by the joy of elevated thoughts describes exactly what Carl feels when contemplating the night sky. The Romantics were wrong about many things, he thinks, but they were right about this. There is an emotional dimension to understanding the world that pure rationalism misses. Facts alone are not enough. We need poetry too. But he is also lonely. The other students come from backgrounds he does not share. They take for granted the education he has fought for. They have not grown up watching their fathers come home exhausted from manual labor. They have not learned to read in libraries because their families cannot afford books. Carl makes friends, but there is always a distance between him and his classmates, a sense that he is performing a role rather than simply being himself. His roommate is a pre-law student from Connecticut whose father is a federal judge. The young man is friendly enough, but he treats college as an interlude before real life, a place to make connections and have experiences before joining his father's firm. He cannot comprehend Carl's intensity about his studies, the way Carl will stay up until 3 in the morning, reading about stellar nucleosynthesis, or arguing about the possibility of life on Mars. "It's just school, Sagan," he says more than once. "Don't take it so seriously." But for Carl, it is not just school. It is everything. Every class is a chance to learn something new about how the universe works. Every professor is a potential mentor who might open doors to research opportunities. Every library session is an expedition into unknown territory. He cannot afford to waste this opportunity, cannot afford to treat his education casually. His parents have sacrificed too much, and his own hunger for knowledge is too fierce. In his junior year, Carl meets Lynn Margulis. She is a biology student, brilliant and intense, with her own intellectual hunger that matches his. They meet in a lecture on evolutionary biology, and afterward they end up in a coffee shop, arguing about whether Lamarckian inheritance has been completely disproven, or whether some form of acquired characteristics might be passed on through mechanisms science has not yet discovered. Lynn is fierce in debate, unwilling to concede points, and Carl finds this both frustrating and exhilarating. Most people defer to him in intellectual discussions, intimidated by his knowledge or simply uninterested in engaging. Lynn does neither. They begin spending long hours together talking about evolution, about the origin of life, about whether consciousness is unique to Earth or could exist elsewhere in the universe. Lynn is one of the first people Carl has met who wants to have the same conversations he wants to have. She has her own obsessions. She is fascinated by cellular biology, by the symbiotic relationships between organisms, by the idea that complexity emerges from cooperation rather than competition, and Carl finds her perspective refreshing, a different angle on the grand questions of life and existence. Their relationship moves quickly from intellectual partnership to romance. In 1957, they marry. Carl is 22, Lynn is 19. Both sets of parents have concerns. They are so young, still students. Not financially stable, but Carl and Lynn are convinced they have found something rare. They understand each other's ambitions, share each other's passion for science, want the same things from life. The marriage is, from the beginning, more intellectual partnership than emotional intimacy. Both Carl and Lynn are obsessed with their work. Both have ambitions that consume most of their energy. They have 2 sons, Dorian and Jeremy, but Carl is never quite present in the way that fatherhood requires. He loves his children in an abstract sense, but he does not know how to be domestic, how to be satisfied with the small rituals of family life. His mind is always elsewhere, always reaching toward the next question, the next discovery. Lynn, despite her own ambitious career, ends up managing most of the childcare, and the resentment builds slowly but steadily. She begins to feel that she sacrificed her work for the family, while Carl sacrificed nothing, that the domestic burden falls on her because she is the woman, regardless of the fact that her scientific work is just as important as his. They argue about division of labor, about priorities, about whether Carl can truly claim to be a partner when he is physically present but mentally absent most of the time. While still a graduate student, Carl begins working with Harold Urey, a Nobel laureate in chemistry who is interested in the origin of the solar system. Urey introduces Carl to the emerging field of planetary science, the study of worlds beyond Earth using the tools of physics, chemistry, and astronomy. This is exactly what Carl has been searching for. Not pure astronomy which focuses on distant stars and galaxies, but planetology, the science of the worlds in our own solar system, the places where we might actually find evidence of life. Urey is a demanding mentor, brilliant but mercurial, capable of enthusiasm and cutting criticism in equal measure. He expects his students to work long hours, to pursue questions relentlessly, to defend their ideas against rigorous skepticism. Carl thrives in this environment. He has always needed to prove himself, always felt like an outsider fighting for recognition, and Urey's demanding standards feel less like pressure than like validation. If Urey takes Carl's work seriously enough to criticize it, then the work must matter. Carl's doctoral dissertation focuses on the physical conditions on the surface of Venus. At the time, in 1960, no one knows for certain what Venus is like. The planet is covered in thick clouds that make direct observation impossible. Some scientists think Venus might be a tropical paradise, warm and wet and potentially habitable. Others think it might be a desert world, hot and dry. Carl uses what is known about the composition of Venus's atmosphere to calculate what the surface temperature must be. The calculations are complex, requiring knowledge of chemistry, physics, and atmospheric science. Carl spends months working through the mathematics, checking and rechecking his assumptions, looking for errors that might invalidate his conclusions. The atmosphere of Venus, he determines, is primarily carbon dioxide, much denser than Earth's atmosphere. This dense CO2 layer would trap heat from the sun through what is known as the greenhouse effect, the same phenomenon that keeps Earth's temperature moderate but which on Venus would be vastly more extreme. His conclusion is startling. Venus, he argues, must be unimaginably hot. The thick carbon dioxide atmosphere creates a greenhouse effect that traps heat from the sun, raising the surface temperature to levels that would melt lead. The planet is not a tropical paradise, it is hell. Most scientists are skeptical. Carl's calculations seem too extreme, his conclusions too dramatic. Venus is Earth's sister planet, similar in size and composition. Surely it cannot be that different, that hostile to life. Some reviewers of his dissertation suggest that he has made errors in his assumptions about atmospheric composition or heat transfer. Others argue that his model is too simplified, that real atmospheres are more complex than his equations account for. But in 1962, the Mariner 2 spacecraft flies past Venus and confirms what Carl predicted. The surface temperature is indeed around 900 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt lead and zinc. The greenhouse effect is real and even more extreme than Carl calculated. The skeptics are forced to acknowledge that the young graduate student was right and they were wrong. Carl Sagan, at 27 years old, has made his first major scientific prediction, and he has been proven right. This success establishes his reputation as a serious planetary scientist, someone whose theoretical work can make accurate predictions about real worlds. This success establishes Carl's reputation as a serious planetary scientist. In 1962, he takes a position at Harvard University, working as an assistant professor in the astronomy department and conducting research at the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory. Harvard is one of the most prestigious institutions in the world, and Carl is aware of the honor, but he is also aware that he does not quite fit. His colleagues are brilliant, but they are also deeply traditional. They study stars and galaxies using the established methods of observational astronomy. Carl wants to study planets using a combination of physics, chemistry, biology, and speculation about what might be possible. Harvard in the 1960s is a bastion of astronomical conservatism. The faculty are experts in stellar spectroscopy, galactic dynamics, cosmological theory. They use the term planetary science with barely concealed disdain if they use it at all. Planets are not serious objects of study for astronomers, the thinking goes. They are too small, too close, too easily observed. The real work of astronomy is understanding stars and galaxies, not cataloguing the characteristics of nearby rocks and gas balls. Carl finds the attitude frustrating and short-sighted. The planets are laboratories for understanding physics and chemistry, and possibly biology. They are the only worlds we can study in detail, the only places beyond Earth where we might find evidence of life. To dismiss them as unworthy of serious attention is to miss one of the most important opportunities in all of science, the chance to answer the question of whether we are alone in the universe. During his years at Harvard from 1962 to 1968, Carl continues to make important contributions to planetary science. He correctly predicts that the seasonal changes observed on Mars are caused by dust storms, not vegetation, as many scientists believe. For decades, astronomers have watched Mars change color with the seasons, dark regions growing and shrinking, and have interpreted these changes as evidence of plant life responding to Martian seasons. Carl analyzes the data and proposes an alternative explanation: wind-blown dust settling and being lifted by seasonal weather patterns. He studies the composition of Jupiter's atmosphere and develops theories about the presence of organic molecules on the planet. If Jupiter has carbon compounds and energy sources from lightning or solar radiation, he argues, then complex chemistry must be occurring in its atmosphere. Perhaps not life as we know it, but organic synthesis, the building blocks that might lead to life under different conditions. He consults for NASA, advising on the design of missions to Mars and Venus. The space agency is planning ambitious robotic missions to the inner solar system, and they need scientists who understand planetary environments. Carl becomes one of the key advisors, helping design experiments to test for life on Mars, to analyze the atmosphere of Venus, to map the surfaces of worlds humans have never touched. But Carl also begins to develop interests that his Harvard colleagues find troubling. He becomes fascinated by the possibility of extraterrestrial intelligence. He argues that the universe is so vast and stars so numerous that it is statistically likely that life has evolved elsewhere. He begins working with Frank Drake, a radio astronomer who has pioneered the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, known as CT. Together they calculate equations about the probability of finding intelligent civilizations. They design hypothetical messages we might send to alien species. They think seriously about how humanity might communicate with beings from other worlds. The Drake equation, formulated by Frank Drake in 1961, attempts to estimate the number of communicative civilizations in the galaxy. It multiplies together several factors: the rate of star formation, the fraction of stars with planets, the number of habitable planets per system, the fraction of habitable planets where life actually develops, the fraction of life that evolves intelligence, the fraction of intelligent species that develop technology capable of interstellar communication, and the length of time such civilizations broadcast detectable signals. Carl becomes obsessed with this equation, not as a tool for generating precise predictions, too many of the variables are unknown, but as a framework for thinking about the question of extraterrestrial intelligence. Even conservative estimates, he argues, suggest thousands or millions of technological civilizations in our galaxy alone. The question is not whether they exist, but whether we will ever make contact with them. To many of Carl's colleagues at Harvard, this is embarrassing. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence is not serious science, they believe. It is speculation, science fiction, the kind of thing that damages the reputation of the astronomy department. Young astronomers are supposed to do rigorous observational work or theoretical calculations, not waste time thinking about hypothetical aliens. When Carl comes up for tenure in 1968, the department votes against him. The rejection devastates Carl. He has worked for 6 years to prove himself at Harvard. He has published important papers, made accurate predictions, consulted for NASA. But none of it matters. The message from his colleagues is clear. He is too interested in popularizing science, too willing to speculate about things that cannot be proven, too visible to the public, and not serious enough for the academy. The tenure denial could have ended Carl's career. Without a permanent academic position, he has no job security, no guarantee of continued research funding, no institutional support. But Cornell University offers him a position as an associate professor in astronomy and director of the newly formed Laboratory for Planetary Studies. Carl accepts. He moves to Ithaca, New York. And though he does not know it yet, the rejection from Harvard is the best thing that will ever happen to him. At Cornell, Carl is free. The university does not care if he appears on television or writes books for general audiences. The administration is proud to have a scientist who can communicate with the public, who raises the profile of the institution, who brings in grant money and attracts talented students. Carl's research continues and expands. He publishes dozens of papers on planetary atmospheres, on the possibilities of life on Mars, on the organic chemistry of Titan. But he also begins to do something else. He begins to think seriously about how to communicate the wonder of astronomy to people who are not scientists. Cornell's campus in Ithaca is beautiful, situated on a hill overlooking Cayuga Lake, with Gothic architecture and gorges cutting through the landscape. Carl loves it immediately. The town is small enough to be manageable, large enough to have bookstores and culture. The academic atmosphere is less stuffy than Harvard, more open to interdisciplinary work and unconventional approaches. He can be himself here in a way he never could in Cambridge. In 1968, the same year he arrives at Cornell, Carl marries his second wife, Linda Salzman. Linda is an artist, and together they begin collaborating on projects that combine science and art. Their most famous collaboration comes in 1972 when NASA asks Carl to design a message to attach to the Pioneer 10 and Pioneer 11 spacecraft. These probes will be the first human-made objects to leave the solar system, traveling into interstellar space where they might, in some distant future, be discovered by an alien civilization. Carl and Linda design what becomes known as the Pioneer plaque. The project consumes them for weeks. How do you communicate with an intelligence that may have no common frame of reference with humanity? You cannot use language because language is arbitrary. You cannot assume they see in the same wavelengths we do, or that they have any concept of human culture or history. Carl and Linda decide on universal references. They show the figures of a man and a woman representing human form. They include a diagram of the hydrogen atom's hyperfine transition, the most common element in the universe, as a kind of cosmic yardstick that any technological civilization would recognize. They draw a radial pattern showing the position of the Sun relative to 14 pulsars, each labeled with its period in binary, allowing the recipients to triangulate our location and the time the message was sent. They include a diagram of the solar system, showing the spacecraft's trajectory from the third planet. It is a small, gold-anodized aluminum plate, just 6 inches by 9 inches, but it represents something profound. It says, "We are here, we exist, we want you to know about us." The plaque makes Carl famous beyond the scientific community. Newspapers around the world publish images of the naked human figures. Some people are inspired by the idea of sending a message to the stars, moved by the notion that humanity would reach out across the cosmic void to seek connection. Others are scandalized by the nudity or dismissive of the whole project as a waste of money. Religious groups complain that the nude figures are obscene. Political conservatives argue that space money should be spent on more practical purposes. Scientific skeptics point out that the chances of the plaque ever being found are infinitesimally small, making the whole exercise pointless. Carl does not care about the criticism. He has done something that matters to him deeply. He has given humanity a voice in the cosmos, however unlikely it is that anyone will ever hear it. The act of creating the message is itself meaningful, a statement about what we value and who we aspire to be. In 1973, Carl publishes his first book for a general audience, The Cosmic Connection. The book is unlike anything previously written about astronomy. Instead of dry explanations of orbital mechanics and spectroscopy, Carl writes about what it means to discover that Earth is not the center of the universe, about the emotional impact of realizing how vast space is, about the philosophical implications of finding out we are alone or not alone in the cosmos. The book is a bestseller. Suddenly, Carl Sagan is not just a planetary scientist, he is a public intellectual, someone who can translate complex science into language that ordinary people find moving and meaningful. The book's success surprises Carl. He has written it quickly, almost as a side project, not expecting it to reach a wide audience. But readers respond to his voice, to the way he combines rigorous science with philosophical reflection, to his obvious love for the subject matter. Fan letters arrive by the hundreds from students and teachers and ordinary people who have never thought much about astronomy, but who find Carl's writing compelling and accessible. But even as his public profile rises, Carl's personal life fractures, his marriage to Lynn deteriorates. The same qualities that make Carl a brilliant communicator, his intensity, his obsessive focus on his work, his need to always be thinking about the next project, make him difficult to live with. In 1977, Carl and Lynn divorce. Carl gets custody of their son, Nick, but he is not equipped to be a single parent. His sister Carol and his mother Rachel help raise the boy, while Carl continues his relentless work schedule. It is also in 1977 that Carl takes on what will become his most famous project. NASA is preparing to launch the Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 spacecraft on a grand tour of the outer solar system. The probes will fly past Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune before heading into interstellar space. NASA asks Carl to lead a committee to create a more elaborate message than the Pioneer plaque, something that will represent Earth's diversity and culture to any extraterrestrial intelligence that might find the spacecraft millions of years in the future. Carl assembles a team that includes his Cornell colleague, Stephen Soter, the astronomer Frank Drake, the artist John Lomberg, and a young writer named Anne Druyan. Together, they spend months deciding what to put on what will be called the Voyager Golden Record. They choose 116 images showing Earth's geography, human anatomy, architecture, and technology. They select music from cultures around the world, from Bach to Beethoven to Chuck Berry to traditional songs from China, India, and Africa. They record greetings in 55 languages. They include natural sounds, wind, rain, animal calls, a heartbeat, a mother's kiss, laughter. The process is simultaneously exhilarating and agonizing. How do you represent all of humanity with 116 images and 90 minutes of audio? Every choice means excluding thousands of alternatives. Which music best represents human creativity? Which images show who we are without being misleading? Should they include pictures of war and poverty, or only show humanity at its best? They debate for hours, sometimes arguing passionately, trying to balance honesty with aspiration. The committee meetings are intense and sometimes contentious. Frank Drake argues for including as much scientific information as possible, diagrams explaining DNA, mathematical constants, the periodic table of elements. John Lomberg wants to emphasize art and beauty, images of paintings, sculptures, architecture. Anne pushes for including sounds that capture the emotional dimension of human life, laughter, crying, a mother's kiss. Stephen Soter worries about making sure everything is technically accurate and won't be misinterpreted by alien intelligence with completely different frame of reference. Carl mediates these discussions, trying to find consensus, trying to honor everyone's priorities, while also keeping in mind the larger purpose. The Golden Record is not just a catalogue of human achievement. It is an act of hope, a statement that despite all our flaws and failures, despite the wars and the poverty and the suffering, we believe that reaching out to the cosmos is worthwhile. We believe that we are worth knowing about. Some of the debates become surprisingly philosophical. Should they include an image of a human fetus? It is beautiful and represents the beginning of life, but some worry it might be too abstract for aliens to understand. Should they include the sound of a kiss? Anne insists yes, arguing that affection is fundamental to human experience, but others worry it might seem frivolous. Should they include Chuck Berry's Johnny B. Good? It is undeniably catchy, a perfect example of rock and roll, But is it too culturally specific? Will aliens a million years from now have any context for understanding it? Carl finds these debates fascinating because they force the committee to confront fundamental questions about what it means to be human. What are the essential characteristics of our species? What should aliens know about us? What are we most proud of? What best represents who we are? In the end, they include a remarkable diversity of content. Music from Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, Stravinsky, as well as traditional music from Java, Peru, Zaire. Louis Armstrong playing jazz, Chuck Berry's rock and roll, an Australian Aboriginal song that has been sung for thousands of years, images of DNA's structure, mathematical definitions, the solar system, Earth's continents and oceans, pictures of humans at different ages and from different cultures, animals, insects, plants, architecture from ancient and modern civilizations, and greetings in 55 languages from Sumerian, a language dead for millennia, to Wu, a Chinese dialect, to English. Carl writes a statement to be included with the record, later published as an essay. In it, he acknowledges the audacity of the project. The chances of the record ever being found are infinitesimally small, but argues that the act of creating it matters regardless of outcome. It represents humanity at its best, curious, creative, hopeful, reaching beyond our limitations to connect with something larger than ourselves. During the intense work on the Golden Record, Carl and Anne fall in love. The moment happens during a phone call about the contents of the record. Anne is in New York, Carl in Ithaca, and they are discussing whether to include the sound of a heartbeat. Anne argues passionately that they must, that a heartbeat is the most universal human sound, the rhythm every person hears in the womb, the sound that connects us all. Carl finds himself moved not just by the argument but by the passion behind it, by Anne's ability to articulate why seemingly small choices matter. They begin talking more about the Golden Record and then about everything else. Anne is brilliant, passionate about science and art in equal measure, capable of matching Carl's intensity without being overwhelmed by it. She has her own career as a writer and producer, her own vision of how to communicate complex ideas to general audiences. For Carl, Anne represents something he has not found in his previous marriages. She is his intellectual equal and his emotional partner, someone who understands why the work matters and who can collaborate on it as a true partner rather than merely supporting him. They marry in 1981, and this marriage, unlike the previous two, will last the rest of Carl's life. Anne becomes his co-author, his creative partner, his anchor. She helps him navigate the demands of fame, reminds him to be present with his children, challenges him when his ideas become too speculative, supports him when the scientific establishment dismisses his work. The Voyager Golden Record launches into space in August and September of 1977. The spacecraft begin their journey through the solar system, sending back unprecedented images of Jupiter's Great Red Spot, Saturn's rings, the moons of the outer planets. And attached to each spacecraft, the Golden Record carries its message. This is what we are. This is what we have created. This is the music we make and the languages we speak and the world we inhabit. But Carl is already thinking about the next project, something more ambitious than a book or a message on a spacecraft. He wants to create a television series that will do for astronomy what nature documentaries have done for biology. He wants to show people the beauty of the cosmos, the strangeness of quantum mechanics, the deep history of Earth, the possibility of life on other worlds. He wants to create something that will make millions of people feel what he felt as a 5-year-old boy looking up at stars in a planetarium. The project is Cosmos, a personal voyage. It takes 3 years to produce from 1977 to 1980. Carl writes the scripts with Anne and Stephen Sota. They film on location in Egypt, Greece, Italy, India, Japan, using cutting-edge special effects to visualize phenomena that cannot be filmed directly. the interior of atoms, the formation of galaxies, the evolution of life on Earth. Carl serves as the host, and his presentation style is unlike anything television has seen before. He does not talk down to the audience. He does not simplify to the point of distortion. Instead, he trusts that viewers are intelligent enough to follow complex ideas if those ideas are presented with clarity and wonder. The production is enormous in scope and ambition. The budget is the largest ever for a public television series. They film Carl standing in front of the pyramids of Giza, explaining how the ancient Egyptians understood astronomy. They travel to the Bibliotheca of Alexandria, recreated in a studio, where Carl discusses the lost knowledge of the ancient world. They use special effects to show the birth and death of stars, the collision of galaxies, the evolution of life from single cells to complex organisms. Carl insists on accuracy even when it makes things more complicated. He will not say things that are scientifically wrong just because they are easier to understand. He spends hours working on single sentences, trying to find language that is both precise and poetic. "We are made of star stuff" is not just a catchy phrase. It is a literal truth about how the heavy elements in our bodies were forged in stellar cores and scattered by supernovae. The cosmos is within us. "We are a way for the universe to know itself" is not mysticism. It is a statement about consciousness emerging from matter. The filming process is grueling. They shoot in deserts in the American Southwest, recreating the surface of Mars. They film underwater sequences to illustrate the oceans of ancient Earth. They travel to Japan to visit Hiroshima, where Carl discusses the dangers of nuclear weapons. In Egypt, standing before the pyramids, Carl sweats through multiple takes as the crew struggles with equipment failures in the heat. In Greece, at the ruins of ancient temples, Carl connects the mythology of the ancients to the reality revealed by modern science. Anne is with him through all of it, collaborating on scripts, offering feedback on his delivery, helping him find the right balance between scientific precision and emotional resonance. Their partnership is remarkable. Anne has a poet's ear for language and a deep understanding of how to move an audience emotionally, while Carl brings the scientific knowledge and the passion for accuracy. Together they create something neither could have achieved alone. There are moments of doubt during production. The budget is enormous, the timeline is tight, and the pressure is intense. Carl worries that he is not charismatic enough for television, that his voice is too nasal, that his New York accent will alienate viewers, that he cannot possibly live up to the expectations the project has created. He worries that the scientific community will mock him for dumbing down complex ideas, that popularizers will criticize him for being too technical, that he will fall into the gap between serious science and entertainment and satisfy no one. Anne talks him through these anxieties. She reminds him that he is not trying to be a television star or an entertainer. He is trying to do something that has never been done before. To create a television series that treats viewers as intelligent adults capable of understanding complex ideas if those ideas are presented with clarity and passion. She reminds him that this is exactly what he has been working toward his entire life, that every lecture he has given, every paper he has written, every conversation he has had about science has been preparation for this moment. And when the series finally airs, when Carl watches the first episode on his television at home in Ithaca, with Anne beside him and a small group of friends and colleagues gathered in the living room, he feels a mixture of pride and terror. This is it. This is the moment when everything he has worked for either succeeds or fails, when the vision that has consumed 3 years of his life either reaches people or disappears into obscurity. The phone starts ringing before the episode is even finished. Friends calling to say they are watching, colleagues calling to offer congratulations, strangers who somehow got his number calling to thank him. The next day, the reviews begin to appear, and they are overwhelmingly positive. Within a week, it is clear that Cosmos is not just a success. It is a phenomenon. Cosmos premieres on PBS in September 1980. The first episode, The Shores of the Cosmic Ocean, opens with Carl standing on a cliff overlooking the Pacific. The cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be, he says. Our faintest contemplations of the cosmos stir us. There is a tingling in the spine, a catch in the voice, a faint sensation, as if a distant memory of falling from a great height. We know we are approaching the grandest of mysteries. The series is an immediate phenomenon. 60 million people watch in the United States alone. Cosmos is broadcast in 60 countries and eventually reaches an estimated audience of 500 million people, making it the most watched PBS series in history. Carl becomes internationally famous. His voice, with its distinctive cadence and slight New York accent, becomes iconic. His turtleneck sweaters become a signature. His ability to make complex science feel both comprehensible and emotionally resonant makes him the most recognizable scientist in the world. Letters pour in from viewers around the world. Teachers write to say that their students are suddenly interested in science. Parents write to thank him for giving them a way to talk to their children about the universe. Astronomers and physicists write to praise the accuracy and beauty of the presentation. A woman in Iowa writes that she has been depressed for years, unable to find meaning in life, and that watching Cosmos gave her a sense of connection to something larger than herself that made her want to keep living. The letters are overwhelming in their volume and their emotion. A high school student in California writes that he has decided to become an astronomer after watching the show. A prison inmate writes that Cosmos is the only thing that makes his confinement bearable, that for 1 hour a week he can escape his cell and travel through space and time. An elderly woman writes that she grew up in a time when girls were not encouraged to be interested in science, and that watching Cosmos at 73 makes her wish she had been born in a different era when she might have studied astronomy herself. Carl tries to respond to as many letters as he can, but there are too many. He stays up late at night, typing responses on his typewriter, trying to acknowledge each person who took the time to write. He feels a responsibility to these people, to the trust they have placed in him by opening their hearts in their letters. They are not just fans of a television show, they are people who are hungry for meaning, for connection to something larger than themselves, for a way to understand their place in the universe, and somehow, inexplicably, he has managed to give them something they needed. But the letters also reveal something troubling. Many people write to tell Carl that Cosmos is the first time they have encountered science presented as something beautiful and meaningful rather than cold and technical. This suggests to Carl that science education is failing, that schools are teaching facts and formulas without conveying the wonder that drives scientific discovery. He begins to think seriously about how to reform science education, how to train teachers to communicate the emotional and philosophical dimensions of science alongside the technical content. This concern will drive much of Carl's work for the rest of his life. He gives talks to educators, writes articles about pedagogy, advocates for changes in how science is taught. He argues that students should learn science as a way of thinking, not just as a body of knowledge. They should learn to ask questions, to demand evidence, to distinguish between what is known and what is merely believed. They should learn that science is not about certainty, but about the honest pursuit of truth, wherever that pursuit might lead. But success brings backlash. Some of Carl's academic colleagues resent his fame. They argue that his work is too speculative, that he is more interested in publicity than rigorous research, that his television appearances diminish the seriousness of science. When Carl is nominated for membership in the National Academy of Sciences, he is rejected. The rejection is humiliating, a clear message from the scientific establishment that popularization is not valued as highly as technical research. Carl's response is to double down on public communication. In 1980, he publishes the companion book to Cosmos, which becomes a bestseller and stays on the New York Times bestseller list for 70 weeks. He continues to appear on television, doing interviews, explaining new discoveries, advocating for space exploration. He becomes a regular guest on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, where his earnest enthusiasm for astronomy makes him both a target of gentle mockery and a beloved figure. It is during these appearances that Carson begins imitating Carl's way of speaking, particularly his emphasis on large numbers. Carson exaggerates Carl's pronunciation of billions, drawing out the word for comic effect, billions and billions. The phrase billions and billions becomes associated with Carl, even though he never actually says it in Cosmos. Carl is initially annoyed by the parody. It reduces his serious message to a catchphrase, but he eventually embraces it with good humor, later using billions and billions as the title for one of his books. In the early 1980s, Carl becomes involved in what might be his most consequential scientific work outside of planetary science. He collaborates with a group of atmospheric scientists to study the potential effects of nuclear war. The resulting research introduces the concept of nuclear winter, the theory that a large-scale nuclear exchange would inject so much smoke and debris into the atmosphere that it would block sunlight, causing global temperatures to plummet and potentially ending most life on Earth. The idea emerges from Carl's work on planetary atmospheres. He has studied how dust storms on Mars affect global temperature, how volcanic eruptions on Earth cause temporary cooling. He realizes that nuclear war would produce fires on a scale never before seen, burning cities and forests across entire continents. The smoke from these fires would rise into the stratosphere, where it would spread around the globe and block sunlight for months or years. The research begins almost by accident. Carl is working with a group of atmospheric scientists on a paper about the effects of volcanic eruptions on climate. Someone mentions the massive fires that would result from nuclear explosions in cities, and Carl's mind immediately makes the connection. If volcanic ash can cool the planet for years, what would the smoke from hundreds of burning cities do? Carl and his colleagues run computer models, inputting data about the number of nuclear weapons, the likely targets, the combustible material in cities, the behavior of smoke in the stratosphere. The results are horrifying. Even a limited nuclear exchange involving a fraction of the weapons in the American and Soviet arsenals would inject enough smoke into the upper atmosphere to block most sunlight from reaching Earth's surface. Temperatures would plummet. Crops would fail. Most people who survived the initial explosions and radiation would die of starvation and cold in the months that followed. The nuclear winter scenario is even worse than the previous understanding of nuclear war's effects. Before this research, strategists had focused on blast damage, radiation, and fallout. They calculated acceptable losses, theorized about winnable nuclear wars, developed doctrines of first strike and mutually assured destruction. But nuclear winter changes the calculus completely. There are no winners. Even the side that strikes first, even the side that suffers less initial damage, will face the same environmental catastrophe. Carl becomes obsessed with communicating this finding to policymakers and the public. He writes op-eds for major newspapers. He appears on news programs. He testifies before congressional committees. He debates military strategists and nuclear strategists, many of whom are skeptical, of the nuclear winter hypothesis. Some accuse Carl of exaggerating the effects of letting his political opposition to nuclear weapons influence his scientific conclusions, but Carl is adamant the science is solid, the computer models have been checked and rechecked. Other scientists have replicated the findings. Nuclear winter is not speculation or worst-case scenario mongering. It is what the physics and atmospheric science predict will happen if nuclear weapons are used in large numbers. And if the science shows that nuclear war threatens human civilization, then scientists have a moral obligation to speak up, to make sure political and military leaders understand the consequences of the weapons they control. The Nuclear Winter paper, published in 1983, has enormous political impact. Carl testifies before Congress, appears on news programs, writes op-eds arguing that nuclear winter makes nuclear war unwinnable and therefore insane. Even if one side strikes first and destroys the enemy's ability to retaliate, he argues, the environmental consequences will kill everyone anyway. There are no winners in nuclear war, only degrees of extinction. He becomes a prominent voice in the nuclear freeze movement, advocating for arms reduction treaties between the United States and Soviet Union. Some critics accuse him of being political, of stepping outside his role as a scientist, of letting his personal beliefs influence his scientific conclusions. Carl's response is that scientists have a responsibility to speak up when their research has implications for human survival. If understanding atmospheric physics reveals that nuclear war threatens civilization, then saying nothing would be immoral. Throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, Carl continues to work on multiple fronts simultaneously. He publishes scientific papers on planetary atmospheres and the possibility of life on Mars. He writes books for general audiences, including Contact, a science fiction novel about humanity's first contact with an extraterrestrial intelligence. He consults for NASA on missions to Mars and Saturn. He advocates for increased funding for space exploration and for the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Contact, published in 1985, is Carl's attempt to work through his ideas about first contact in narrative form. The novel tells the story of Ellie Arroway, a SETI researcher who detects a signal from the star Vega containing instructions for building a machine. The book explores questions Carl has thought about for decades. How would humanity react to proof of extraterrestrial intelligence? What would we say to them? What would they say to us? What are the political, religious, and philosophical implications of learning we are not alone? Writing Contact is different from writing non-fiction. Carl has to create characters, dialogue, plot tension, elements he has never had to worry about in his scientific papers or his popular science books. He works on the novel for years, writing and rewriting, trying to make the science accurate while also making the story compelling. Anne helps immensely, reading drafts, offering suggestions, helping him understand how to build narrative tension. The protagonist, Ellie, is partly based on several female scientists Carl knows, including Jill Tarter, a real SETI researcher who has dedicated her life to searching for extraterrestrial signals. But Ellie is also partly Carl himself, an outsider fighting for respect from the scientific establishment, someone whose passion for the search for extraterrestrial intelligence is seen as unserious by more traditional colleagues. The novel deals with the conflict between science and religion in ways that Carl finds important. Ellie is an atheist who bases her worldview on evidence and reason, but she falls in love with a religious philosopher who believes in God and sees no contradiction between faith and appreciation for the cosmos. Carl uses their relationship to explore whether science and religion must be in conflict or can coexist, each addressing different human needs. When the signal is detected in the novel, humanity's response is chaotic and complex. Governments compete for control of the information. Religious leaders debate whether aliens can have souls. Scientists argue about how to interpret the message. The public swings between euphoria and terror. This messiness, Carl believes, is realistic. First contact would not be clean or simple. It would reveal all of our existing divisions and conflicts, even as it united us in the knowledge that we are not alone. The novel is a bestseller and is later adapted into a film starring Jodie Foster. Carl serves as a consultant on the film, but does not live to see it released. He dies in December 1996. The film premieres in July 1997. The movie captures some of his vision, but also Hollywoodizes it, adding romance and drama that do not exist in the book. Still, it introduces his ideas about SETI and first contact to millions of people who might never have thought seriously about these questions. Anne attends the premiere of Contact 6 months after Carl's death. She watches Jodie Foster portray a version of the character Carl created, watches the story unfold on screen, hears some of Carl's own words incorporated into the dialogue. It is bittersweet. He would have loved seeing his novel adapted, would have had opinions about every choice the filmmakers made, would have been excited about reaching a new audience. But he is gone, and Anne watches alone, surrounded by friends and colleagues, but missing the one person who should be there. But by the mid-1990s, Carl's health begins to fail. In 1994, he is diagnosed with myelodysplasia, a bone marrow disease that prevents his body from producing healthy blood cells. The prognosis is grim. Without treatment, he will die within months. With treatment, a bone marrow transplant, he might survive for years, but the odds are not good. Carl undergoes his first bone marrow transplant in 1994. His sister Carol is the donor. The procedure is brutal. Carl's existing bone marrow must be destroyed using chemotherapy and radiation before Carol's marrow can be transplanted. The recovery is slow and painful. For months, Carl is too weak to work, too sick to do anything but try to survive. The experience is profoundly humbling for someone who has spent his life studying the cosmos. The universe is vast and eternal, but his body is fragile and finite. He lies in a hospital bed, unable to do the work that has defined him, and confronts the reality that all his knowledge, all his accomplishments, all his fame cannot save him from this. He is mortal, like everyone else, subject to the same biological vulnerabilities, the same inevitable decline. The first transplant is a nightmare of physical suffering. The chemotherapy destroys not just his bone marrow, but his strength, his appetite, his ability to think clearly. He loses his hair, his weight drops dramatically. He develops infections that require powerful antibiotics. For weeks he is too sick to do anything but lie in bed and endure. Anne is with him constantly, reading to him when he is too weak to read himself, handling correspondence, managing his affairs, being the interface between Carl and a world that still wants something from him. During this time, Carl has long periods alone with his thoughts. He thinks about his life, about the choices he has made, about what he has accomplished and what he has failed to do. He thinks about his children, about how he was never quite the father they needed. He thinks about his marriages, about how his obsessive focus on work damaged his relationships. He thinks about the scientific establishment's rejection of him, about how much energy he spent fighting for respect from people who valued technical expertise over communication. But he also thinks about the work itself, the papers he published, the predictions he made that turned out to be correct, the missions he consulted on, the television series that reached hundreds of millions of people, the books that are still being read, the messages on the Pioneer and Voyager spacecraft that will outlast human civilization itself. When measured against cosmic timescales, none of it matters. In a few billion years, the sun will expand and consume the Earth, and every human achievement will be erased. But on human timescales, the only timescales that actually matter to human beings, maybe he has done something worthwhile. He thinks about mortality and legacy. What does it mean to leave something behind? His scientific papers will be superseded by new research. His television series will become dated as science advances. His books will eventually go out of print. But perhaps the ideas will persist. Perhaps some of the people who watched Cosmos or read his books will carry forward the sense of wonder and curiosity he tried to instill. Perhaps the message is not remember Carl Sagan, but look up at the stars and ask questions. If he has contributed to that, if even a few people think about the universe differently because of his work, then maybe that is enough. Anne brings him letters from well-wishers, colleagues writing to offer encouragement, students writing to say how much his work meant to them, ordinary people writing to thank him for Cosmos, for contact, for giving them a way to think about their place in the universe. Carl is moved by these letters, but also slightly embarrassed. He has never been good at accepting praise, never quite believed that he deserves the recognition he has received. But as he lies in the hospital bed facing the reality of his own death, he allows himself to accept that maybe he has made a difference, that maybe the work was worth the cost. But as soon as he has enough strength, Carl returns to writing. He is working on 2 books simultaneously. One is Pale Blue Dot, a meditation on the photograph of Earth taken by Voyager 1 from 4 billion miles away. In the photograph, Earth is a single pixel, a pale blue dot suspended in a sunbeam. Carl writes about what this image means, about how it should humble us, about how all of human history has taken place on that tiny speck, about how we should take better care of the only home we have. The other book is The Demon-Haunted World, Science as a Candle in the Dark. It is Carl's passionate defense of scientific thinking against pseudoscience, superstition, and irrationality. He writes about the importance of skepticism, about how to distinguish reliable knowledge from comforting delusions, about why science is not just a body of facts, but a way of thinking that values evidence over wishful thinking. Both books are published in 1994 and 1995 as Carl undergoes a second bone marrow transplant, then a third. Each transplant fails to cure the myelodysplasia. Each recovery period is longer and harder than the last. By late 1996, Carl knows he is dying, his body is failing, his immune system is compromised, he develops pneumonia, and his lungs begin to fill with fluid. In his final weeks, Carl is surrounded by Anne and his children. They have complicated relationships, especially with Dorian and Jeremy, who grew up with a father who was often absent, often more focused on his work than on them. But they come now, and there is something in the finality of the situation that allows for honesty and reconciliation. Carl apologizes for not being the father they needed, for prioritizing his work over their needs, for missing so many moments of their childhoods. They do not pretend the hurt was not real, but they also acknowledge that he was who he was, that the work mattered, that his contributions to the world were real and valuable. Dorian, his oldest son, sits by the bedside one afternoon, and they have a conversation that Carl wishes they could have had years earlier. Dorian has become a writer and software developer, someone who inherited Carl's intellectual curiosity but directed it toward different questions. He tells his father that he understands now, as an adult, why the work consumed him so completely. He understands that Carl was driven by something larger than personal ambition, that the questions about the cosmos and humanity's place in it were not just academic interests, but existential needs. "I used to be angry," Dorian says quietly. "When you missed my birthday because you were at a conference, or when you were physically there but mentally somewhere else, thinking about Mars or whatever. I thought you didn't care about us." Carl's voice is weak,
but he manages to respond. I did care. I do care. I just didn't know how to show it. I didn't know how to be both the father you needed and the person I needed to be. I know, Dorian says. That's what I figured out.
You weren't choosing between us and the work. You were just being who you are. And maybe the work was important enough that it was okay for it to come first sometimes. Maybe not every father needs to coach Little League and help with homework. Maybe some fathers give their children different things. The conversation is not absolution exactly. It does not erase the hurt or the missed opportunities, but it is something. An acknowledgement that relationships are complicated, that people are flawed, that love can exist even when it is not expressed in conventional ways. Jeremy, the younger son, has a harder time. He is still angry, still struggling with the abandonment he felt as a child. He comes to visit but keeps his emotional distance, unable or unwilling to offer the kind of reconciliation Dorian has found. Carl respects this. He knows he does not deserve forgiveness just because he is dying. Jeremy will process his feelings in his own time, in his own way, and Carl will not be alive to see how that process unfolds. This is one of the costs of how he lived his life, and he accepts it. Nick, his son with Linda, is there too, along with Sasha and Sam, his children, with Anne. The younger children do not carry the same weight of resentment. They knew a different Carl, an older man who had perhaps learned something from the failures of his earlier marriages. He was still not a conventional father, still obsessed with his work, but he was more present, more aware of what he was missing. Anne orchestrates these family gatherings with quiet competence, making sure everyone has time with Carl, managing the emotional complexity of bringing together children from different marriages, handling the logistics of Carl's medical care, while also supporting everyone else. She is exhausted. Carl can see it in her eyes, but she never complains, never suggests that the burden is too much. He continues to work when he has the strength, continues to think about the projects he will not live to complete, continues to hope that his writings will make a difference after he is gone. On December 20th, 1996, in a hospital room in Seattle, Carl Sagan dies at the age of 62. The news of his death spreads around the world within hours. Tributes pour in from scientists, politicians, writers and ordinary people who grew up watching Cosmos and learning to see the universe as Carl taught them to see it. President Bill Clinton issues a statement calling Carl a great scientist and a great teacher, and noting that his gifts to mankind were infinite. But the Planetary Society, which Carl co-founded, announces that they will continue his work of advocating for space exploration and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. In the days after Carl's death, newspapers and television programs review his life and legacy. They show clips from Cosmos, images of the Voyager Golden Record, photographs of Carl at telescopes and in television studios and standing before audiences explaining the wonders of science. They quote his most famous lines, "We are made of star stuff. The cosmos is within us. We are a way for the universe to know itself." Somewhere, something incredible is waiting to be known. But what is not immediately apparent in these tributes is the complexity of Carl's legacy. He was not simply the gentle astronomer who made people love space. He was a man of contradictions, someone who preached cosmic humility while fighting fiercely for recognition, who advocated for skepticism while remaining optimistic about extraterrestrial life beyond what the evidence warranted, who could be generous and patient with the public, but competitive and difficult with colleagues. In the years after his death, biographies begin to appear that complicate the saintly image. Kay Davidson's biography reveals Carl's difficult marriages, his struggles with academic acceptance, his use of marijuana as a creative tool, though Carl had written about this anonymously as Mr. X during his lifetime. Colleagues speak more openly about his ego, about his need for the spotlight, about the resentment his fame generated within the scientific community. But these revelations do not diminish Carl's accomplishments. If anything, they make them more impressive. The man who emerged from a Brooklyn tenement and faced rejection from Harvard and the National Academy of Sciences still managed to become the most influential science communicator in history. The scientist who was told his interests were not serious enough still made accurate predictions about Venus and Mars, still contributed to multiple NASA missions, still advanced humanity's understanding of planetary science and the possibility of life beyond Earth. In 2014, 18 years after Carl's death, a new version of Cosmos premieres on Fox and National Geographic. The host is Neil deGrasse Tyson, an astrophysicist who cites Carl as his inspiration for entering science. Tyson tells the story of how, as a high school student in the Bronx, he was considering which college to attend, and Carl invited him to visit Cornell, spent a Saturday showing him around, and gave him a book inscribed with his personal phone number in case Tyson's bus back to New York was delayed and he needed a place to stay. Tyson did not end up attending Cornell, but the kindness of an already famous scientist taking time for a teenager from the Bronx stayed with him forever. The new series updates the science and uses modern special effects, but the structure and spirit are pure Sagan. The goal remains the same, to make people feel the wonder of the cosmos, to help them understand their place in the universe, to translate the language of science into the language of human meaning. Today, more than 25 years after his death, Carl Sagan's influence persists in ways both obvious and subtle. Science communicators from Bill Nye to Brian Cox to countless YouTubers and podcasters cite him as a model. His books remain in print and continue to find new readers. Clips from the original Cosmos circulate on social media, introducing each new generation to his voice and vision. The Voyager spacecraft that carry the golden record are now in interstellar space, the first human-made objects to leave the solar system. Voyager 1 is now more than 14 billion miles from Earth, traveling at 38,000 miles per hour, carrying its message to no one in particular and everyone who might ever find it. They will travel through the galaxy for billions of years, long after Earth itself is gone, carrying Carl's message about who we were and what we created. The pale blue dot photograph he wrote about continues to be invoked in discussions of climate change and the fragility of our planet. His warnings about nuclear winter remain relevant in an era of renewed nuclear tensions. But perhaps Carl's most important legacy is not any specific scientific contribution or television program or book. It is the idea he spent his entire life demonstrating, that science is not cold or mechanical or separate from human emotion. That understanding how the universe works does not diminish its beauty but enhances it. That looking up at the stars and feeling wonder is not childish but profound. That asking questions about our place in the cosmos is one of the most fundamentally human things we can do. Carl never stopped being the 5-year-old boy who went to the World's Fair and saw a vision of the future that made him want to reach beyond his circumstances. He never lost the sense of wonder that his mother encouraged when she took him to the library and told him his questions mattered. Every television appearance, every book, every lecture, every conversation with a stranger who asked about the stars was an attempt to give other people what had been given to him, permission to look up, to ask questions, to feel amazed by the universe we inhabit. In Pale Blue Dot, writing from his hospital bed as death approached, Carl described what he hoped people would take from the photograph of Earth from billions of miles away. He wrote about how it shows the folly of human conflicts, how it reveals the absurdity of wars fought over patches of ground on a tiny world, how it demonstrates our responsibility to preserve the only home we know. But he also wrote about something else, the courage it took for humanity to send a spacecraft far enough to take that photograph, the audacity of building machines that could show us ourselves from the perspective of the cosmos. This was always Carl's message. Yes, we are small. Yes, the universe is vast and indifferent, and we are just temporary patterns of atoms on an ordinary planet orbiting an ordinary star. But we are also extraordinary. We are matter that has become conscious, life that has learned to contemplate the cosmos that created it. We are capable of understanding things far beyond our immediate experience, of building tools that extend our senses across billions of miles, of asking questions that our ancestors could not have imagined. The hospital room in Seattle is quiet now. The monitors have been turned off. The manuscript of Pale Blue Dot rests on the table, waiting to be published. Anne sits beside the bed, holding Carl's hand. Outside, the December sky is overcast, no stars visible through the clouds. But somewhere above those clouds, beyond Earth's atmosphere, beyond the orbit of the moon and the paths of the planets, the Voyager spacecraft continue their journey into the unknown, carrying the golden record, carrying Carl's message. Somewhere, in the distant future, another intelligence might find that record. They might decode the images and sounds. They might wonder about the beings who created it. They might try to imagine what it was like to live on that pale blue dot, to look up at the stars and wonder if anyone else was out there doing the same thing. And if they do, if some alien mind millions of years from now encounters that golden disk and tries to understand the civilization that made it, they will be encountering Carl Sagan's legacy. Not just the specific information on the record, but the impulse that created it. The urge to reach out, to communicate, to say, we were here, we existed, we wanted you to know about us. The same impulse that drove a 5-year-old boy in Brooklyn to ask his mother about the stars, that drove a graduate student to predict the temperature of Venus, that drove a professor to create a television series that would help millions of people see the universe as he saw it. Carl Sagan was not perfect. He was driven by ego as well as wonder, by a need for recognition as well as a desire to educate. He made mistakes in his personal life, hurt people he loved through his obsessive focus on work, sometimes let his optimism about extraterrestrial life outrun the evidence. He faced rejection from the institutions he wanted to impress, spent his career fighting for respect from colleagues who thought popularization was beneath serious scientists. But he also did something remarkable. He took the questions of a curious child and turned them into a life's work. He took the wonder he felt looking up at stars and found ways to share it with hundreds of millions of people. He took the cold mathematics of astrophysics and transformed them into poetry. He made people care about planets they would never visit, about stars they could barely see, about the deep history of the cosmos and humanity's small but significant place within it. In his last book, The Demon-Haunted World, Carl wrote about why science matters, not because it gives us power over nature, not because it produces technology, but because it is a way of seeing clearly, of distinguishing truth from comforting illusion. He wrote about the candle in the dark, the small flame of reason and evidence that allows us to navigate a universe that does not care about our wishes. He wrote about the importance of teaching each generation to think critically, to ask for evidence, to resist the seductions of certainty and the comfort of easy answers. This was the other side of Carl's wonder, not just amazement at the beauty of the cosmos, but commitment to understanding it honestly, not just poetry, but rigor, not just asking questions, but demanding that answers be tested against reality. Wonder and skepticism together, emotion and reason intertwined. The boy from Brooklyn who became the voice of the cosmos never resolved the tensions in his own life. He never fully reconciled his need for academic respectability with his talent for popular communication. He never stopped feeling like an outsider, even as he became one of the most famous scientists in the world. He never quite managed to be present for his children in the way he was present for his audiences. The drive that made him extraordinary also made him difficult, made his personal relationships complicated, made rest and satisfaction impossible. But perhaps that is the real lesson of Carl Sagan's life. Not that genius comes without cost, though it does. Not that wonder requires sacrifice, though it often does. But that the qualities that cause pain can also be the source of meaning. The restlessness that made Carl a difficult husband and father was the same restlessness that drove him to keep asking questions, keep pushing boundaries, keep trying to help people see beyond their immediate circumstances. The need for recognition that created professional conflicts was connected to the belief that science communication mattered enough to fight for. Carl Sagan died believing that his work would continue, that the ideas he spent his life developing would find new audiences, that the mission of helping people understand and appreciate the cosmos would be carried forward by others. He was right. The scientists he inspired went on to make new discoveries. The communicators he influenced found new ways to translate science into meaning. The children who watched Cosmos grew up to ask questions about the universe and sometimes to find answers. Among those children was a generation of scientists and engineers who would go on to accomplish things Carl could only dream about. They would land rovers on Mars and discover thousands of exoplanets orbiting other stars. They would detect gravitational waves from colliding black holes and take the first photograph of a black hole's event horizon. They would build space telescopes that can see nearly to the beginning of time itself. And many of them would trace their inspiration back to a television series they watched as children, to a man with a turtleneck and a distinctive voice who made them believe that understanding the universe was the most important thing a person could do. In 2012, 16 years after Carl's death, NASA's Curiosity rover lands on Mars. The mission is wildly successful, and the scientists involved explicitly credit Carl with inspiring their careers and advocating for Mars exploration when it was not fashionable. In 2019, the first photograph of a black hole's event horizon is released, and astronomers around the world share clips from Cosmos where Carl explained what black holes are and why they matter. In 2020, during a global pandemic that highlights the importance of scientific thinking, Carl's books experience a resurgence, particularly The Demon-Haunted World, with its emphasis on critical thinking and distinguishing truth from fiction. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence continues, now with more powerful telescopes and more sophisticated search strategies than Carl could have imagined. No signals have been detected yet, but the search goes on, driven by the same question that consumed Carl. Are we alone? And as each new exoplanet is discovered, thousands now confirmed, with estimates suggesting billions more in our galaxy alone, Carl's optimism about the prevalence of planets seems prescient. His warnings about climate change and environmental destruction also prove tragically accurate. In Cosmos, Carl talked about the greenhouse effect and how human activity could alter Earth's climate. In the decades after his death, as global temperatures rise and weather patterns become more extreme, policymakers and activists cite his words about our responsibility to preserve the pale blue dot, the only home we have. But perhaps the most profound aspect of Carl's legacy is not what he predicted or what he discovered, but how he made people feel about science and the universe. There is a particular sensation that many people describe when watching Cosmos or reading Carl's books, a mixture of awe and humility, of feeling simultaneously small and significant, of understanding that we are part of something vastly larger than ourselves. This feeling has a name now in some circles: the Sagan effect. It is the emotional response to confronting cosmic perspective, the psychological shift that happens when you truly grasp the scale of space and time. Educators have studied this effect and tried to understand how to replicate it. What made Carl so effective at inspiring this sense of wonder? It was partly his communication style, the poetic language, the dramatic pauses, the obvious passion for the subject matter. But it was also something more fundamental: his ability to connect the cold facts of science to the warm realities of human experience. He never forgot that his audience was made of people, that they cared about meaning and purpose and their place in the world. He gave them science, yes, but he also gave them philosophy, poetry, and permission to feel awed by the universe. And, somewhere in the galaxy, 2 spacecraft carry on through the darkness, bearing the record of a species that learned to wonder, to question, to reach beyond itself, carrying the voice of a man who never stopped being amazed that the universe exists at all, that we exist within it, that we are capable of knowing these things. The stars Carl looked up at as a child are still there, still burning, still sending their light across the vastness of space. New generations of children look up and ask the same questions he asked. What are they? How far away? Is anyone else out there? And if Carl Sagan's life means anything, if his work accomplished what he hoped it would accomplish, some of those children will be told what his mother told him. Find out. Go to the library. Read the books. Ask the questions. The answers are there, waiting to be discovered. The cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be. And for 62 years, Carl Sagan was our guide to it, our translator, our fellow traveller in the grand adventure of trying to understand where we are and what it all means. He is gone now, but the stars remain. The questions remain. The wonder remains. And as long as someone somewhere looks up at the night sky and feels that tingling in the spine, that catch in the voice, that sense of approaching the grandest of mysteries, Carl Sagan's work continues. We are made of star stuff, he taught us. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself. And in knowing ourselves and our world, in asking questions about the universe and our place within it, we fulfill a purpose that Carl spent his life illuminating, to be conscious participants in the unfolding story of existence, to add our small light to the great darkness, to wonder and to seek and to share what we find with anyone willing to listen. That was Carl Sagan's gift, not just knowledge but wonder, not just facts but meaning, not just science but the reminder that science is a human endeavor driven by curiosity and awe, by the same impulse that made a 5-year-old boy ask his mother about the stars and changed everything that came after.